Hi, my name is Eve Love, and I work here at Sotterley, and I'm also a docent here at Sotterley. And the reason I'm here is I love history, and of course, Sotterley is the place to be if you are a history lover. Um, People often think that history is something static, that it doesn't have any movement. Christopher Columbus was in 1492, and you think of everything in terms of facts and that there's no changes. So the problem becomes, how do you make history not static? And that is done through continuous learning. I'm a big fan of continuous learning. I'm also interested in genealogy, and a genealogist deals with birth dates and marriage dates and death dates. But there's a whole lot of life that goes on between those dates, and there's a whole lot of history that happens before and after dates. And so that's what we try to tell here at Sotterley, that it's not just about dates and certain people doing things on certain dates, but it's how people lived here, what went on at this site. And so one way we try to continue to improve our story and find out more about our story is through archaeology at the site. And archaeology is really it's a tool that teases you, because you find little bits and pieces and you lay them all out, and then you try to piece it together. And when you get a bigger piece, it tells a bigger story. And so that's what we try to do with our site here. We try to do some archaeology and add to our story. And we have really good stories here, and I just love telling them. Preservation is important. Our stories are told in the buildings and the artifacts that we have. But without those buildings, it's really hard to get people to be able to imagine what was here. And it's very important to keep old buildings, whether it is a house or a barn or a smokehouse, because when people touch that and see that and feel it, then it becomes real to them, and they don't have to imagine. So preservation is a very important aspect of what we encourage here at Sotterley.
So I hear that this room underwent some recent work, and that you were interested in and invested in this project personally. Can you tell us a little more about what happened in here?
Right. Well, the beautiful woodwork that you see in this room was coming apart. This happens in a wooden house, particularly a 300-year-old wooden house. Parts of the paneling were separating away. This so-called floating panel was separating out of the grooves into which it was originally put, and there were cracks running down the face of it. And if you go over to the fireplace and you look at that, it was the wood behind those two pictures was buckling out, because debris from the chimney behind that was falling down and pushing the wood out into the room. So it was decided that we needed to renovate the room. And we hired a remarkable man, John O'Rourke, who has done work at Mount Vernon and at Williamsburg, and who for the last 25 years has been our preservation advisor here at Sotterley to conduct this project. And so what he did was to take apart the paneling wherever it was broken. And so parts of this paneling were taken out, parts of the paneling behind the fireplace were taken out, and some of the paneling around this area here and over in the corner all were removed, with the idea that they would be repaired, put back in place, and then the room would be repainted. Now, in the process of doing that, we learned some new things about the place. And one of them had to do with the chimney. chimney that goes up above this fireplace, which was part of the original house built around 1703. When you look at the fireplace today, you see a marble front that was put on in the late 20th century. Behind that was a typical brick fireplace. Well, people believed when we started this project that the 18th century chimney had been rebuilt substantially 100 years ago by Mr. Sotterley. And that little of the original 18th century chimney was left. But when they took off that paneling behind those pictures, what they found was bricks that were clearly from the early 18th century, and some bricks that must have been brought here to Maryland in the 17th century because they were bricks from the 17th century that had been used in the creation of the original chimney. So the project of taking it apart not only helped us keep the room in its more original condition, stop the deterioration of it, but it allowed us to learn something about how that chimney had been preserved over the last 300 years. And one of the things that they did in the midst of this project was not just take off the wood, but do paint samples. Take little chips of the paint from all around the room. And that taught us some things too that were interesting. And one of the stories that was told when I first came here had to do with a part of the paneling in this room that comes off. A little piece of paneling that would fit in here. Well, we knew that paneling had been off for some time, but there were different stories. One story was that it had been taken off at the time of the Civil War to provide a hiding place where the then owner of the property, who was a Southern sympathizer, could hide things from Union troops who would come onto the property. So that was one story. Another story was, I don't know, that removed panel had been done by Herbert Sotterley because he wanted to tell the story about the Civil War. So what did we do? Or not we, the people who were doing the project. They took paint samples. They took paint samples from the face of this panel, and they took paint samples from the side of the panel. And when they compared those two paint samples, they found that the paint on the outside, the surface of the panel, was had the same series of colors that go all the way back to when the room was first painted. But the sample on the side of the panel had those colors only back until about 1770, when a major renovation of the room was done. So that told us that this removable panel had been created at the time of the 1770 renovation, long before the Civil War. Now, how it was used, why they did it, we don't know. But the technology of paint sample analysis allows us to understand when that secret place was made. So that's an example of a kind of thing you can learn in the process of preserving the room.
So what's the significance of this room here?
Well, it's got many significances, but one that's quite important is that it's the oldest room in the house. Now, when it was built, it didn't look like this. It did not have this elegant woodwork in it, but it is the oldest part of the house, And it allows us to understand how that first house was built, this unusual process called earth fast or post in ground construction, where cedar and cypress trunks were cut down, fashioned into pillars and buried in the ground to form the structural elements of the house. And even though this room is over 300 years old now, those beams that were buried in the ground are still where they were when they were first put in. So this is an example of how preserving a particular way of building buildings allows you to tell stories about how things were done 300 years ago. This is also a room that has been full of mythology, legend, and stories which cannot be documented. And when I first came here almost 25 years ago, we enjoyed telling these fictitious stories because people at that time thought they were an more interesting way to bring the people alive. For example, we used to open the door of this closet and point to a ladder, a wooden ladder that was inside the closet and went up to a closet upstairs. And the story we would tell had to do with a pirate called Long Arm, I think it was. And he was going to attack the property. And when he came, the owner of the property then sent his family climbing up the ladder to take refuge and safety upstairs. Well, if you look at the ladder carefully, it's very clearly made of lumber that you would have bought at a store like Lowe's at the beginning of the 20th century. And this was an example of the kind of undocumented but theoretically interesting stories that were being told 25 years ago as a way of making this property interesting. I have been privileged to be here at a time when everyone is committed to documenting true stories about the people who lived here and how they lived their lives. And I must say, I find them far more interesting than the mythology and legends that I was first told about. Okay. Now, if you're in Mount Vernon, it's very clear that Mount Vernon's objective would be to have the walls in any room in the house look the way they did when George Washington lived there. But we have a house here that's 300 years old without any George Washington-like figure to be the focal point of the house. We've got a house where we tell stories from the 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. And so what color do you paint rooms? Do you paint them the color they were painted originally? We know these colors, as I said, from looking at paint chips. Or do you do something else? Well, what we have decided to do here at Sotterley is to keep the colors that were in the rooms at about 1960, when Mabel Ingalls, our last owner, established a foundation that currently is known as Historic Sotterley. So these are Mabel Ingalls' colors. And she was a person who liked bright, vibrant colors, and that actually makes the house possibly more interesting than if it had been painted the way her parents did. Because her parents painted almost the whole of the first floor of the house off-white. Now, I love off-white. We've got it in my house. But I think choosing Mabel's colors works very well here at Sotterley, main house. And I want to point out something that is another truth about preservation, and that is you're never finished. particularly in a wooden house that has been painted, because the wood is always changing in small ways, and the paint does not stay on forever. This room was renovated in about 2005. They came in, they took all, again, this was John O'Rourke and one of his colleagues. They took about 200 years worth of paint off of the walls of this room by hand in an environmentally proper way. And that took the whole summer. And when they were finished, they repaired the wood paneling as they did in the other room, and they repainted the whole room. That was in about 2005. Now we're 16 years later, and already you see the paint is chipping off the room. So preservation is not something that's once one and done. It's a constant struggle to keep up with the way buildings evolve.
Okay. My name is Sam Baldwin. I currently live a few miles from Sotterley, but grew up in Baltimore. Met my wife, Jan Briscoe, in law school. Knew absolutely nothing about Sotterley whatsoever, except that when I popped the question and we set the date for the wedding, our reception was here at Sotterley, and that was my first introduction. Lived on the Briscoe family farm, and my father-in-law, John Hanson Briscoe, was president of the board at Sotterley, and the Briscoe family had been connected with Sotterley for hundreds of years. So I came to learn a little bit more about Sotterley. Really wasn't all that interested in it personally, but knew of it. But then over the years, as I got to know more and more people who worked at Sotterley, volunteered here, and in particular, as I learned the history of St. Mary's County and how Sotterley represented so many aspects of the history of this county. And of course, as I became more active in the community myself, I found ways to become involved with Sotterley, ways to contribute, whether it's as a volunteer at events, or to give financial support, because I know Sotterley needs the financial support. They need volunteers from people who can volunteer, but they certainly need financial support. And that was something that I learned from my father-in-law, John Hanson Briscoe. He reached out to his friends from the Maryland legislature, Senator Ben Cardin, who served with him, and Representative Steny Hoyer, who was in the House, of course, but previously was Senate President for Maryland. The three of them worked together with a whole host of other people to rescue Sotterley when it was on the brink of collapse, on the brink of closing, and on the brink of being lost to the public. So we're standing in the hallway of Sotterley, one of the oldest sections of Sotterley, and Sotterley is very famous and recognized Chippendale staircase. And there was a day that I happened to be at Sotterley on a weekend. Sotterley was closed, but I happened to be here, and I saw somebody at the mansion, and not knowing who it was, I came up to the mansion, and it turned out to be that it was John Rourke, who was working in the adjoining room, restoring what we call the Red Room. And so John told me about what he was doing with the Red Room, how it was funded, and then brought me into this hallway here and said that Sotterley had a donor who was going to paint the walls and had a donor who was going to work on the floors. And John went further and said that the one thing that they didn't have was somebody to fund the restoration of this staircase. John had a person in mind who was perfect for the job. All they needed was funding. I didn't ask how much it was going to be, but I told John I would make it happen. Didn't ask my wife. Turns out it turned out okay. But the three of us donating the money that we had for a very specified purpose. We're going to do what we can to make this room pretty, and it is. My wife Jan Briscoe and I, our contribution was this Chinese Chippendale staircase. A small contribution. We don't really ask for credit for doing that. We didn't do it looking for credit. We did it because we know Sotterley's mission. We believe in the mission. We want to share this history that's represented in this house with the public, and all our small part was this staircase here.
Now, what's the provenance of this staircase?
Oh, it's the Providence. That I cannot tell you, other than the fact that, of course, there is the legend that, there's the fact that it was done by, I believe his name was Richard Baldwin. It may have come over as an indentured servant during that day and age when people came here as indentured servants from England to America. And he was a skilled carpenter. There was probably a furniture design book from England, and he used patterns from that furniture design book to do this Chinese Chippendale staircase. Legend has it also that George Washington over at Mount Vernon was so taken by the work that Bolton did that George Washington wanted him to come over there and work on Mount Vernon. Somewhere on this staircase, they say there's a missing piece. And the legend of that missing piece is Mr. Bolton's period of indentureness ended, and his work on this staircase ended as well. Perfect, imperfect, it's still a wonderful piece of craftsmanship.
Hi, my name is Gwen Bankins, and I'm a direct descendant of the Kane family. Agnes Kane Callum was our family genealogist who traced our roots back here in the mid to late 70s. So I came upon Sotterley as a middle school student, and it was the last place I wanted to be, but we were made to come because this was something that was new. And a lot of my objection to being here was because we really didn't have our story told in the history books, and I didn't understand why we would need to come to a plantation house where typically there were slaves and they were basically laborers. You can grasp that part of history. But as I went to college and learned about an in-depth understanding of Black history from slavery to freedom, it brought about a new perspective to history. As Agnes began doing oral histories here at Sotterley, I could see young Caucasian students excited about the history of my family, what it was to walk in their shoes, what it was to eat the food that they ate. And with the education, which added another facet, and seeing actual people who had no history tied to Smecco, it made me understand that there was a deeper story. But without Agnes's work and working with other descendants, Mr. Briscoe and other descendants from historic Sotterley, that story wouldn't have been told. Everyone has a story, and that story needs to be preserved. It's so important that we understand the experiences of our family members and others before we grew up. To me, it gives you the empowerment to make your life better. Preserving the buildings, modern technology sometimes makes us forget of the tenacity of our ancestors and how they were able to make things work. You know, many without electricity, you know, and how they were able to live a normal life, you know, with the things that they had to endure. Preserving history, understanding how ancestors endured what they did, it gives you the ability to live at another level. It empowers you to get through your challenges. Preservation is so important. Telling the story transparently is even more important. But sharing the experiences with individuals who may have been ancestors direct descendants from the slaveholders, from the indentured servants. It gives you a great picture. History needs to be talked about, and that story needs to be preserved. And we need everyone to really to connect to Sotterley, learn about the stories, and share their experiences as well. Sotterley is a safe space to understand history.
And laid up in the creek across the way. And the cruising guide said that there was a plantation nearby, so we came across and found the rickety old pier that was here at the time and came up. There were sheep in the meadow below, and that was my introduction to Sotterley. I can't remember who gave me the tour. It might have been Lizette Day, who was here at that time and doing the tours. A few years later, my wife and I moved down here to Leonardtown from up in Rockville. And people that we met got us involved as first as donors and just people who enjoyed coming. But when I had to retire in 1997, I came and started volunteering in the garden, and I've been there ever since. And the place grows on you, it gets under your skin. And started doing the tours relatively early on. And it was all pretty much about the people who lived in this house. There was little mention, if any, of the enslaved African Americans who were had been on the property, and their descendants who were tenants and such. But we already had been involved with Agnes Callum and her family. So more and more we started talking about the issue of slavery. Till today, it's one of the principal areas of discussion on the tours. That in every room, slaves had their effect. People who lived here in the slave times were constantly in contact with slaves who laid the fire and made the food and did all the things necessary to make the house comfortable. Not to mention all of those who made their lifestyle possible by working the plantation, working the farm as it became later on. And I think that's a wonderful way to go, making this a place where discussions about racial issues can be held safely. This is a place for that. The house itself underwent a major restoration during the late 90s and the early years of this century. But it's never static. This is a 300-year-old wooden house. Constantly needs repairs. In this room, the dining room where we're sitting, we've just redone all of the wallpaper that dates to the time of Mabel Ingalls, Herbert Satterley's daughter. It's the only room in the house that reflects that time period. And there's been discussion as to whether or not it should have been taken back, but I'm very happy that I was able to help in the decision to keep Mabel Ingalls' decor and to help refurbish it. So preservation of this structure is incredibly important. We need all the help we can get. If you have a particular interest in any aspect of old houses, you can find something here that will get you involved, get under your skin. This is a wonderful place, and I'm so grateful that I've been able to be a part of it, and I'm going to keep on as long as I can.